These sections are going to look at the development of a democratic state in India. First off, we're going to take a look at what factors influence the development of democracy in India. First off is the refugee crisis immediately after independence. Millions had to move as a result of the split of the partition. The states of Punjab and Bengal were the most complex and difficult, largely because they had very mixed populations. And so each province had to be split in half between Pakistan and India. New border lines were announced only a couple of days after independence, so not a lot of planning time was given to the people, so they had to move very quickly and give up their lives very quickly. So millions of Muslims and Hindus all of a sudden found themselves on the wrong side of the border, and they were fearing for their lives because of nationalists and violence on both sides, and so they wanted to move to safety. 15 million people had to abandon their homes to get to the right side of the line to be protected. The Punjab province had Sikhs that were scattered across the province, and the Sikhs, well, they called for a separate Sikh state, but they were largely ignored during the negotiations. And so million Sikh and Hindus, they had to leave Pakistan for India in the Punjab province. East Punjab became 60% Hindu and 35% Sikh, whereas West Punjab became almost totally Muslim because they all moved out. Law and order broke down along these borders as communal violence and attacks on both sides resulted in up to 1 million deaths. And some saw this as ethnic cleansing, where in certain communities they're literally forcing people to move out because of their religion or murdering people because of their religion. Bengal also saw a movement, just as Punjab did, by Hindus and Muslims, but this was a much slower process, resulting in a lot less violence. It wasn't quite as bad as on the other side, but it was a long, slow process that led to other problems. By the end of 1947, peace had largely been restored along the borders. 40 million Muslims remained in India. Several million Hindus remained in Pakistan, but not nearly as many. The resettlement of refugees was a huge financial burden for both sides that in many ways they're still recovering from in this resettlement. Patterns of communication, infrastructure, agriculture, irrigation, and trade were all disrupted, and new patterns had to be organized within the nations and also with new trade partners. And so we have Jinnah and Nehru splitting Pakistan and India, and it's a bloody mess that results. Issues relating to unity and consolidation, and how they become one nation after this split. At independence, there were about 550 princely states headed by local hereditary rulers, i.e. princes, who had signed treaties specifically with Britain. And so this map kind of shows the yellow areas were actually controlled directly by the British government, whereas the areas in pink, there were treaties signed, and so the local prince ruled over the area, but was kind of an ally and worked directly with the British government, kind of a part of the empire almost. And so these made up 40% of British India. But as soon as the British left, each of these princely states were left to decide what they want to do. They could try for independence, or they could try to join one of these new Pakistan or Indian states. There was very strong pressure from both sides to give up that independent status because they had strong economic ties to the rest of India. They could not be just an island in the middle of India. Plus, a lot of the Indian nationalists, they didn't want that. They didn't want to have a patchwork country where all of a sudden you have an entirely different country like Hyderabad right in the middle, in the heartland of your country. So they were going to be pushed hard to join a side and not maintain their independence. Nehru's deputy, Vallabhbhai Patel, was given the responsibility of unifying India. His job was to make this map one color, and he successfully did it. He unified India largely through persuasion and negotiation with these princes, and in a couple cases via direct force using the army. all but 3 provinces joined in return for this deal of pensions. They get kind of a government paycheck. The right to use their titles and palaces. They get to stay prince. And the right to keep some of their personal holdings. So some of the money that they were using as princes. So they get to basically retain their lifestyle. Hyderabad and Junagada refused to join. So there's going to be a little conflict there. So here's Hyderabad right in the middle, this huge chunk in the middle, and Junagada right there. And so, yeah, they got to go. And so these areas were controlled by Muslim princes ruling over Hindu populations. And they figured if they gave up, they're out. And so India had to annex these states by force. And largely the population was pretty happy about that because they were now going to be part of a majority Hindu nation with majority Hindu leaders. Kashmir also refused to join. The leader of Kashmir didn't really want to join either side. Eventually, Pakistan started to threaten them a little bit. And so the leader of Kashmir turned to the British saying, "Hey, help us." And the British said, "We'll help you, but you got to join India." And so in the end, they joined India, but this just leads to a larger fight that continues to this day as far as who gets Kashmir. India unification is totally complete with the withdrawal of the last European port cities. So the French, they leave Pondicherry, right here, in 1954. And the Portuguese are kicked out of Goa after they invaded in 1961. So the Portuguese and the French are the last holdouts. Challenges of religion. Pakistan was created as a Muslim state, and they have the population of 95% Muslims, whereas India becomes a secular state, and they want a mix of all religions. And so the Congress Party, and especially Nehru, support secularism, a separation of church and state. To guarantee this, in 1949, Congress passed a resolution on the rights of minorities, guaranteeing equal rights regardless of religion. 1950, the Constitution established a secular state with a separation of religion and state with no official state religion. Even though Hindus dominated, Hindu is not the official state religion. They have no state religion, much like America. Not all Hindus were happy about that, though. And so they're going to fight a little bit. And we have the same thing in America, where not all people of different religions are happy about that, and they may fight. So Hindu nationalists were not satisfied with secularism. India was 80% Hindu, and so certain groups called for a more religious state. Bharatiya Jana Sangh and Rashtriya Swayamsek Sangh targeted this large 80% population. And so they're going to protest certain bills that they see as targeting Hinduism. And so Hindu nationalists attack certain laws like the Hindu Code Bill, which attempted to give women more rights. They saw this as a threat to traditional Hindu identities and values. We'll talk more about that law later. They were really never a major problem during Nehru's life, but after Nehru dies, they rise up and become much stronger over time. And so the rise of Hindu nationalism and communal violence become a feature of Indian politics and still are to this day. Foreign crises, as far as world history here. Nehru becomes a leader of the non-alignment movement during the Cold War. This means no alliances with the Western or Soviet blocs. And so this map kind of shows early on the major leaders of the non-alignment movement that didn't want to go for communism or capitalism. And when it comes to these battles of the Cold War, they wanted to stay out of it and hopefully provide some balance as kind of this alternative. And so these are the starting nations, but it has expanded since then to include most of Africa, large parts of the Middle East, and large parts of Latin America as well. And so he really starts something where they're kind of rejecting both sides. He also becomes, and so in this, he remains in the British Commonwealth, so he remains strong ties with the British, but he really rejects their views on the Cold War and capitalism. He also becomes a champion for anti-colonialism and anti-racism, so he pushes for other nations to reject colonialism, especially the British colonies all over Africa. Kashmir, still a problem, probably always going to be a problem. It's a large state strategically placed in the northwest bordering India, Afghanistan, Pakistan, China. In 1947, it was led by a Hindu prince with a majority Muslim population. India and Pakistan fought a war for control from December 1947 to January 1949, until the United Nations had to step in and say, okay, let's stop this. And so the UN set up this kind of line of control here, where they remained to kind of attempt to keep the peace as long as possible. India, Pakistan, the people of Kashmir, nobody's happy with this, and so the UN just had to stay to keep order between these two areas. Two more wars followed up in 1965 and in 1999, and starting in the 90s, both states became nuclear powers, causing the international community in the world to become more concerned, and the dispute is still unsolved and tensions still remain quite high. And so this little chunk of land they've been fighting over, and even China has gotten into the mix too. Speaking of China, here they are. Right. They've had good relations as neighbors early on, dealing with issues of rural poverty and underdevelopment, and they've had some moments where they've fought, but largely they've been pretty strong neighbors with a similar history in some ways, getting rid of imperialism and developing and trying to get rid of poverty and develop into a world power. 1957, they signed a treaty promoting trade, recognizing territorial rights. They're working together. Competition starts to really destroy this relationship, though, as they each wanted to be the leading Asian nation within the developing world. So they both kind of get a little power hungry. Disputes over territory along their borders start to pop up, and so these areas kind of highlighted here and here. And then to make things worse, in 1959, China invades Tibet and pretty much takes it, despite the world protesting, and in some ways they're still protesting over this annexation and just taking over of Tibet. This area was led by the Dalai Lama, the leader of Tibetan Buddhism. And so the Dalai Lama, under threats, he runs into India. India accepts him as somebody for political asylum, after the Chinese troops just occupy and take over and massacre a lot of Tibetans. China protests this move. As a result, the Dalai Lama sets up a government in exile, and the Dalai Lama has been waiting there ever since. So he left as a young man. He's now an old man, still waiting to return to his government, and he is not likely to be able to return to his government anytime soon. And we'll see what happens when he dies. This is another unresolved issue. 1962, this tension builds up until there's a short war when Chinese troops, and the war is only, I think it's 3 months long, and when Chinese troops occupy a disputed area in northeast India. So they take over this chunk of land. China and India, they fight over it a bit. In the end, they give up this chunk of land, Arunachal Pradesh, and instead they get this little chunk of Kashmir, Aksai Chin, and so they get that in exchange for that, and largely they've been pretty peaceful ever since. But this is a major hit to the Communist Party of India after they get invaded by Communist China. And that's a little look at what factors influence the development of democracy in India.